Hello, welcome to this episode of Quake. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at a video from a Catholic vlogger, Brian Holdsworth, and looking at maybe doing a bit of a response to that from a Quaker perspective. So I've been following Brian Holdsworth for a number of years now, and I think he's a really excellent person to follow on YouTube. So I would recommend having a look at his videos. He is a Catholic, so, you know, don't go in there not knowing that. And so obviously a lot of what he does videos about is on Catholic specific matters, which is interesting but not necessarily relevant to this channel. But he does look at wider topics as well affecting society. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but he's a very succinct speaker. I think he's very easy to listen to. He doesn't use academic language or things like that. He's quite down to earth. He gives lots of analogies, and he's in my age bracket as well, so I can relate to a lot of the cultural references that he's referring to as well. So I find him quite good, so please do check him out. The video that I'm focusing on in particular from Brian Holdsworth is, and I'll put it in the description, is a video that he did on, he titled it Formal versus Unscripted Prayer. And I looked at that, I was like, I know what he's going to do. He's obviously going to favour formal prayer because he's a Catholic. And I was looking at it like that, and I'm probably going to, as a Quaker, probably favour unscripted prayer. And so I watched this video, and I think his arguments were very compelling, and I think there's certainly a lot of areas of agreement that I had with what he was saying. But that is how it went. I was like, I don't think, or certainly I don't think he's understood it maybe from a Quaker perspective. Now, he's not in this video actually trying to argue against Quakerism in any way at all. He doesn't mention Quakers at all. So I'm not trying to put an argument in there where there isn't actually one. He isn't making this point at all. But I think it was just, I was watching this video and think, well, I think maybe unscripted prayer needs a bit of, or certainly a Quaker understanding of unscripted prayer needs a bit of a rebuttal, so to speak. So I'm not arguing against Brian Holdsworth. I think he's far more eloquent than me, so I'm not going to do that. But I think maybe just getting it out there that maybe some things that maybe, because it's not his tradition, that maybe he hadn't necessarily thought of. I think the main thing that Catholics just don't get when looking at unscripted worship, and especially probably from a Quaker understanding as well, is the idea of the content of worship in a Quaker understanding. So the content. Quakers, obviously, what they're trying to do when they have their worship is that they are trying to have no content, effectively. I'm not trying to say that Quakers believe that when they worship, that they sort of like the quietist view of worship, that you empty yourself so that you can be filled with God's love or divine messages and things like that. I don't necessarily hold to that, but the less the better, really. You know, you're trying to center down in and being attuned to what the inner light is telling you or is leading you to do, and you can only do that when you truly listen. I've talked a lot in a lot of my videos about this listening, that expectant waiting that we do in our meeting, and I think that's true, but there is no content to that. And so I agree with what Brian does say in his video, in that, you know, if we use our meeting for worship to just have a constant loop of our own thoughts and our own worries and our own concerns and all basically us for an hour, that can become a quite egocentric way of worshipping and not necessarily doing any listening at all. And he does mention that, and he does put that as a downfall of unscripted or individual worship, and I completely agree with that. I don't think that's what Quakers ought to be doing. I'm not to say that, and he mentions it as well, not to say at all that I don't think it's worthwhile asking the inner light for guidance with a problem that you might have. I think that's completely fine, but you've got to be listening as well to an answer to that. If you're just constantly worrying or talking about your problems or thinking about your problems or thinking about how you can be in a better position, I don't think that's necessarily nourishing worship. So I think that's the main area. So he obviously thinks that prayer involves content, involves things that you say, or yes, things that you say, and depending on what you say, basically changes whether or not the prayer or the worship is effective or nourishing spiritually. And my general response to this is that Quaker worship and our unscripted worship and prayer should have less content anyway. So it's not about making it individual at all. It's about centering down and listening. One thing that he mentioned, which I do quite like and agree with, is he said that before he became a Catholic, he was trying to basically be more spontaneous with his worship and with his prayer. And so he would redo scripted prayers in a unscripted way, or he would make his own prayers up. And he said that he came up, and in the end, finding it really hard to be spontaneous, or find new ways to be spontaneous in his worship. And I think from a Quaker perspective, I absolutely agree with that. And again, would come to this idea of content, that yes, I mean, if you're trying to create new content in anything that you do, eventually you're going to hit a wall and say, well, I've said everything. I've said this in as many different ways as I can think of now. There's nothing else I can do. So how can I still be spontaneous? But obviously, if you are not, if you're trying to reduce what you say, then you don't have that problem at all, because you're not trying to think of more words or more ways of having your worship. You actually think of reducing that, and so that gets rid of that. But I think in regards to spontaneity, I think there is a message to be had there in Quakerism as well. I have mentioned it before, and that's how we do our worship, and especially how we give vocal ministry. Being spontaneous, our worship, our vocal ministry should be spontaneous. You know, it's not something which is scripted. It's something which comes when we feel so led, when we've been given something to say, that we say it. And with Quakerism, I think we can fall into the trap, because vocal ministry is spontaneous, that it can be something that we kind of see as a performance. And so for many reasons, that might mean that people who maybe balk from that don't give ministry even when they probably should, or people who maybe like the limelight a little bit do it too much, or do it in a way which is not coming from the spirit, but coming from their own ego. So I think in being spontaneous, we shouldn't feel that we need to give vocal ministry in order to make the meeting worthwhile. And so we shouldn't feel forced to spontaneously say anything just so that there has been some vocal ministry. That's not necessarily what we believe is the sole form of ministry in our meeting for worship. We've also got to understand that in our meetings for worship, silent ministry is equally as important. Maybe the meeting is leading up to saying something maybe next time, or maybe what people in the meeting need at that meeting for worship is silent ministry, to really listen to what's being said. Maybe it doesn't need to be anything that actually needs to be shared with the group, but maybe that silence and that upholding is leading to inward ministry rather than necessarily vocal ministry as well. So I think Quakerism can fall into the trap of this sort of performance of vocal ministry, which it really shouldn't. That's not, if there isn't any vocal ministry, that is fine. It does need to be unscripted. It can't be prepared. It can't be performed. It needs to be given when so led. One criticism that he does give on unscripted prayer is that what tends to happen is that if you do your own prayers instead of the prescribed ones, as you would have in a Catholic service, for example, is that inevitably you end up just creating your own routine and your own traditions. And so his point is, well, why not have the traditions which, have been, seen as excellent spiritually for hundreds of years, instead of your own one, which basically does a poor imitation of what the service already is. And to a certain extent, that's true. I do see that, especially in terms of how I center down, for example. I do have a routine that I use in order to help me get to that greater level of listening, which I don't necessarily have in my day to day. I have to go through a kind of a routine in order to get there, and that routine has a certain structure. I do sometimes have prayers that I say and use, not necessarily all the time, and that helps me lead in. And so I do create these sort of routines. And so I do see what he's saying is that, well, why don't you just use the ones that, that would be used in the Catholic service then? And I was like, well, my point would be that that's not that routine isn't my worship, isn't actually my prayer necessarily. It can be, but that is my technique to help me getting to my worship, I suppose. So it might be similar, instead of to a worship in a Catholic service, but maybe like the preparation to getting to the service or something like that, like the preparations that you take to get ready to worship. That's when I use maybe my routine. After that, I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe I'll give vocal ministry. Maybe I'll be given something that's solid for me, and then I'll have to wrestle with that for however long. But the routine part isn't the worship, or isn't part of my service. And I think this is maybe what I would come back and say, well, if you're making your service, the whole service and the whole worship, your routine or a routine, then how spiritually nourishing is that actually? Because you're not doing any listening there. You are just saying what you're being told to say. He talks about the reason why formal prayer is good, and he makes the analogy of when you meet people for the first time. So when people are strangers, that you fall into social etiquette. You don't start off a conversation by immediately talking about really personal things or really deep things necessarily. You talk about the weather, you ask for their name, you ask if they have any children. You go through a certain pattern of socially acceptable questions and responses as you're slowly building up a relationship, and then you can talk about those stuff. And so what he says is it's sort of the same with prayers to the divine. If you have not been really having much of a prayer life or a spiritual life, then using the formal prayers helps you start that process for yourself, but also helps to sort of introduce you to the divine using social conventions. I think I get that. I think he says it better than I do there. But I think I would push back on a couple of things. I'm quite happy with the idea that if, I've never prayed or never had anything particularly spiritual as part of my life, I would understand why I would be a stranger to God or the divine in that relationship, because I've never engaged. And so, yes, me and him, I can see how he's a stranger to me. However, if we flip that round, I think we can't really say that the light is a stranger, that we are a stranger to the light, if you get what I'm saying. Because if we believe, or certainly what I believe about God, that he knows me better than I know myself, knows where I'm going, knows where I've been, knows me way better, then he's not a stranger. And so I wouldn't necessarily, I don't think that formal social etiquette is necessarily required necessarily, certainly on the part of the light. The light could probably talk to me in a highly personal way, because it knows me better than I know myself. Yes, I could sort of understand that maybe with him, or going backwards, that I might need to be maybe more formal. But I think also that we're not on the same level either. I think this is, so in terms of this analogy, maybe I'm guessing Brian didn't necessarily mean to take this too literally, but I think it's important as well. We're not on the same level playing field here. There, we're not equals to God in this discussion. It's like that. I think in the ways that we talk, we shouldn't actually necessarily be doing much of the talking as well. We should be listening. It's kind of like, instead of meeting a person another person on the same equal footing is sort of like meeting a teacher. We talk about Christ coming to teach his people himself. And so instead of, if you go into a classroom, you wouldn't necessarily, I mean, if you know the teacher really well, you might have a conversation with them, but effectively you sit down, you listen, and they might ask questions and you respond. I think that's how more I see it necessarily. And obviously then as you build that relationship, of course, yes, then it becomes more of a to and fro, and then you can have a more free conversation. But I think at first, instead of you both being like very formal with each other, I think more listen. I think that's where I'd come from. Listen to the wisdom that's coming to you, respond to it, and that's how a relationship can start. He goes on to talk about as well the idea that the reason why formal prayers are so good is because these have been made by, really spiritually influential people. And so why do you think you'd be able to come up with something better? And especially if you're at the very beginning of your spiritual journey, like in my teacher reference earlier, you use what you're given to help you along your way as you take your first steps, sort of like with stabilizers on your bike before you then start taking them off and going off on your own. So the formal prayers are sort of like the stabilizers in that context. Not necessarily wholly, I'm not saying that is a perfect metaphor, but you see what I mean. And I get that, and I think that's true. However, I think the problem that I have with formal prayer is that even if it comes from someone else, the problem with that is that it doesn't come from you. It's not your words. And so therefore, how spiritually nourishing is that really to just listen to just say the words that someone else found found useful or spiritually enriching for them? If it just becomes something that you say without you really fully understanding it or really feeling it in the way that the person who originally said it felt it or meant it, they're empty words. They're not actually helping you. They are giving you, yes, they're giving you a rubric to worship by, but if it means nothing to you, how can that help you? How, if you're given something to say, for example, if you're in a foreign language classroom, for example, and you're given a speech of French to say, but you don't speak French, you'll just say it as best pronunciation as you can, but you won't understand any of it. And so what use is that? And so if you then had to go and produce your own French without having, even if you had this in front of you, you can copy it down, sure, but you won't be able to make your own stuff from it, and that won't mean anything to you. He mentions this idea that, you should come out of worship or prayer, or the aim of prayer and worship is to be transformed, to come closer to the divine. And absolutely, I agree. And so, but I just wondered, how close do you get just with formal prayer if it's not coming from the Spirit, if it's not coming from your desire to connect with that that light by yourself on your own terms? If you're just using words or phrases, I could go into a Catholic mass and say the words that they say and feel nothing, and in a way that's good, because we all have spiritual dryness, and it's good to sort of top it up even when you have that. But I think ultimately, if you can come out of that mass, of that service, having just said what you've been told to say, I think there's less chance of that being transformative than even if you just sat with yourself and looked at your life in a really thorough way. I'm not saying that's necessarily great worship, but I think that's still quite transformative, because you can still say, wow, I need to change this, or this is not how it should be, I need to do something about that. That can still lead you on a journey which will lead to more spiritual encounters, or a more spiritual encounter than that initial one, than if I just went and said some things, not necessarily felt it, went home and thought, oh, well, I did, I said the words, it's all good. It doesn't lead you on the same journey, I don't think. I think the last point that I want to make is, and it happens all the time when you look at unscripted, spontaneous prayer. G.K. Chesterton said this about Quakers actually as well, the idea that if prayer is inward and not communal, then it becomes individualistic worship, and it can very easily lead to idolatry and worshipping yourself instead of worshipping the divine. And how do you know if it's all inward? How do you know if it's actually the divine at all and not just yourself and putting yourself up as God in your own head? And here both me and Brian Holdsworth come to a pretty similar conclusion, say that community is what keeps this working. He says that through formal worship, community comes together because these are things that everyone knows and can uphold each other. I would say that unscripted or inward worship fits with community very well as well, because we as Quakers believe that it is in two gathering together, two or more gathering together, that the divine is present, that we need other people. I can't have a meeting for worship by myself. I could, but then it would just be private contemplation, I suppose, rather than a meeting for worship. I need someone else there because I need that upholding. I need the silent ministry. If anyone's been to a Quaker meeting, they know what I mean when that sort of tangible silence, it's a thing, it's a presence in the room as well. And that's necessary in order to worship, and it stabilizes us as well as a group. You know, if I were just in my head and someone else was just in their head and we were just sitting quietly in a room, that's right, that's not spiritually enriching. But if we believe that actually through this silence we're expecting something to happen that comes from outside, we're expecting a breakthrough into our community, and we can only do that if we're together. So community is what keeps us from going solely into ourselves and private contemplation and self-worship, and into a more spiritual plane of expectant waiting and silent ministry to help us get to a better relationship with the divine. So yeah, I think I just felt, after watching that, I thought what he was saying about formal prayer was really good, but I felt that unscripted silent prayer needed a bit more of a time in the limelight. So I thought I would do a video sort of to uphold that side of the argument of formal prayer versus unscripted prayer. So let me know what you think. How do these two work in your spiritual life? Do you use formal prayer at all as a Quaker, or do you think that we shouldn't use it at all? Do you think we should use more of it? Let me know. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.